Good evening. I'm Nigel Bovey, Vice Chair of the Christian Evidence Society. Welcome to Questions of Our Times. Today's question is, how can I find wholeness in a broken world? My guest today was a university student when she was diagnosed with lymphoma. For 6 long months, she endured intensive, extensive, and evasive treatment. During this time, she committed herself to God. In remission, she went on to gain a doctorate in physics, where her research involved the hair-raising adventure of flying through thunderstorms in an aeroplane. Subsequently, she studied theology, was ordained and served as a parish priest in the Church of England. Today, she is Chief Executive of the Guild of Health and St. Raphael. As an academic and author, she writes on the relationship between religion and science. And so, to talk with me today about health and wholeness is the Revd Dr Gillian Straine. Gillian, welcome. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, Nigel. It's good to be here.
Thank you. You are the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO of the Guild of Health and St. Raphael. Can you please tell us, what does a guild do?
Well, in all four Gospels, this is how far back it goes. In all four Gospels, Jesus asks his friends to do two things: make new disciples and to heal. And since 1905, the Guild of Health and St. Raphael has been doing that in lots of different ways to kind of suit the world it was working in. And today we resource three distinct groups of people to help think about the links between health and faith. The first is individuals. We resource individuals who think that faith might somehow be connected to their health in a world where we have science and medicine and all those good things as well. We work with churches to be hubs for healing for the whole community. And what an opportunity we have right now as we're beginning to come out of lockdown in the UK, helping the churches, resourcing churches who have been really stretched recently to provide community healing from the trauma we've been going through. So that's the second community. And the third community is a bit more academic and professional. And we work with healthcare professionals and academics to make links between Christian healing and whatever sphere they work in. So particularly medicine, the arts, and psychology.
So do people actually come to you asking for healing, asking you to pray for them, for their healing?
So yes, they do. We sort of work at two levels on that. We resource churches to be places and individuals to be healers, to give people the confidence to say in a simple phrase, can I pray for you? And help churches to do that. But we also do it ourselves. Right now, we do it every Friday, noonday prayer. You can join us on Facebook and YouTube and leave a prayer request on our website, gohealth.org.uk 24/7. And we're here praying for you. We're a group of people who think that it makes a bit of difference.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, actually. I mean, when somebody says, will you pray for me or for a member of my family, we're unwell, we need physical healing, what kind of assurance or even guarantee can you give that their prayer will be answered?
So it's a really good question. One I've had with our insurance company, quite interestingly as well. That was an interesting conversation, Nigel. So I believe full-heartedly that God hears our prayers when we pray for people to get better. However, we cannot guarantee the outcome of this because we don't have God's eye on what's going on. So sometimes we might pray for someone to get better. I do quite a lot of this in my job, get better. And that's natural, right? We don't want to see our friends and family in pain. We want our world to be less painful and full of suffering. It's natural, but we do not understand how God is working. And also the definition of Christian healing isn't, here we go, getting better necessarily. Christian healing is much broader and deeper. So when somebody is in pain and ill, the healing might be reconciliation with their family. It might be reconciliation with what they're facing. It's not just getting better, and that's the gift of the Christian healing ministry. It operates on a much deeper level.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you introduced that concept now, because I'd like to talk about that a little later on in our conversation, if we may, because it's already becoming clear that healing isn't just one thing, but actually there's a whole whole range of conditions that need a dis-ease corrected, if you like. Let's talk personally, if we may. I said there in the introduction that you suffered cancer when you were a student. Is that how you became involved in the whole, or interested in the whole concept of healing?
Well, I could look backwards and say it was a very well worked out plan to get from Scottish schoolgirl in Aberdeen to this position today, but it wasn't. I'm following my nose and following my gut, as everybody else is. But I do feel it's in running the Guild and running a Christian healing organization, I'm wearing, a professional hat and a personal hat. As a scientist, I'm passionate about Christians engaging with science. Science tells us the best knowledge we have about the world. And as Christians, we believe God made the world. So we should well be paying attention to science in this. And that also involves medicine, psychology, neuropsychology, everything. The science is telling us about one aspect of what it means to be a human being. I'm also a priest. I dressed up specially for this evening. And I've seen the impact of good pastoral ministry on a community. The folk that go to church and the folk that darken the door but once or twice in their lifetimes. The church and the church's healing ministry can have such a profound impact, especially at difficult times. So I'm passionate about that. But yes, as a cancer survivor as well, I was 21. And I've had plenty of time to reflect on the experience. But one of the most profound parts of the journey through cancer was I expected to, here we go again, be better the day I went into remission, 21st of January, the year 2001. And that didn't happen. That was only the beginning of a much longer process, which I wasn't expecting. To find what I would call healing. And it taught me that, when bad stuff happens, healing is required, but it's not necessarily about getting better. It's about learning to live in a world where X has happened, where you can carry on having faith in God, yourself, the world, whatever it is, even though you've been through what you've been through. So it's an opportunity for meaning making. So it was terrible and awful. But also I learned a lot through it. So in running the Guild, I sort of intertwine all those different aspects together.
Okay. In some years ago, when I interviewed you for the War Cry newspaper about your story, you said that when you went into remission, you actually, when you were given the news of remission, rather than sort of get up and dance and throw parties, you actually suffered from depression. To what extent is that an indication that healing involves more than just our physical bodies?
And it's such a good question and such a timely question at the moment. If you want to talk about health and healing as a church, given what we've been through in the pandemic, the mental health impact, the words that are being thrown around is cataclysmic, young people, old people, everyone, healthcare professionals, frontline people, the traumatic impact on them has been huge. So in the church, we have to be talking about mental health, and we all have mental health. Just like you have physical health, some days good days, some days bad. Some people have chronic conditions, some people don't. We all have mental health, and it changes all the time. And what's fascinating is science is now telling us what the Hebrew Bible has known for a long time, that we're not just bodies, bodies with spirits that need to connect to God. We're all interconnected together, right? And if one thing is out of kilter, then it can affect everything else. Now, for example, we maybe had the experience of working really hard, and then you go on holiday and you get a cold. You stress, stress affects your immune system, and you get ill. We're mind, body, and spirit all mashed together. And I think when I had a period of depression, and I've had more since, but after cancer, what I did after I came out of treatment and went into remission, is I went off happily back into my old life, which was back down in London doing a PhD in physics with the same people who knew me before I was ill. Try to carry on with what I would have been doing if I hadn't had that experience. And I just didn't fit anymore. So, you know, there's children toys you get a cube and there's different holes and you've got to put the square through the square hole and circle through the circle hole. I felt like I was trying to fit myself back into my old life and I didn't fit anymore. And the more I tried to shove myself through that hole, the more I was hurting. And on reflection, I think what had happened was I had changed by what I'd been through. The suffering of cancer, like many serious illnesses or accidents or life experiences, the suffering is multifaceted. It is physical, of course. The treatment is horrible. But it's also social. You can't mix with your friend. You look weird. You might not be able to work. You know, you can't say the C word. You become the person who brings down any room. And no one wants to talk to you. And it's also psychologically difficult because you're being smashed up against the idea of your own death. I mean, in your head, it's hard to not think death when you think cancer. And this type of suffering, Simone Weil called it affliction. And affliction is different from, you know, breaking your leg or bumping your head on the table, because it leaves a trace upon your soul. And I love that expression because it gets into the depths of what profound periods of suffering does. It leaves a trace upon your soul. And so to find healing after that, I had to look at how I had changed and to learn to live again, having been through that.
So,
sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, that concept of it leaving a trace upon your soul, you must have asked, I should imagine, many questions during your illness and your immediate remission. What questions were you asking of God, and what questions were you asking of yourself?
Well, when you're in treatment for cancer, and anyone watching, I'm sure will be able to relate this, you're quite busy. You've got an appointment card that looks a bit like a railway timetable when we used to be able to go on trains. You know, you had loads to do. You've got to go for this treatment, speak to that person, sort out a wig, think about this, treatment. And, you know, there's plenty to occupy your mind. And if you were a good Presbyterian, like I was back then, I'm an Anglican now, there's plenty of works to be getting on with that made you happy. But certainly my questions came in a few flashes. I remember when I was ill thinking, well, I'm not working. You know, my parents were amazing and looked after me. Not that bad, really. But then I suddenly remembered that this might kill me. And I remember saying, well, actually, I can't handle that. I'll give that to God and leave it afterwards. And it was later that I had more profound questions over what this was. And the one that stayed with me is, as the psalmist says, you have created me in my mother's womb. Or Jeremiah, you have carved me in your palm of your hand. And you think, really? Because my body is killing me. So how do you reconcile those two things? And that's the thing that takes time and doesn't respond to placebos. And it can take a lot longer.
Yes, this concept that God knits us in our mother's womb is very, on one level, very comforting. That God is sort of providential and has everything under control. But it does raise the question of where disease comes from. Does that mean that God somehow in his knitting dropped a stitch? How did you come to an answer that you could live with?
Well, it comes down to the definition of what we think is going on in the world. We have this concept of sin. And sin's a tricky word to bring up when you talk about healing, but inevitably it pops up. And there's unhelpful ways to think about sin, and there's more helpful ways to think about sin. And for me, what I found useful is understanding that this world is clearly not perfect because we're at a distance from God. Then the question is, well, what do we do about it? And some theologians will say, well, there's nothing you got to do about it. That's just the way it is. Just pray and hope it all goes, it gets better. That's grace and forgiveness. But there's other theologians which say, well, there's learning to be done in this vale of tears. And we can work to grow in love and grow in wisdom because the Bible doesn't just tell us to, join this club and all will be well. It's join this club and you've got a job to do. And that is to spread the love of God in the world. We can do that irrespective of our bodies and what's going on with them. And I've been at deathbeds where people are dying and they're so peaceful and they're teaching me how to love. So what I learned over time that when illness comes, and in a way, and this is not something I would say in a pastoral conversation if somebody was ill, but from a sort of more academic point of view, that yes, things go wrong and there's sin and cancer cells erupt in the body because there's random mutations that go on. But that's all because we've got freedom. And if God was intervening all the time and making everything better, we wouldn't be free. But we do have freedom. It's how we choose to use that freedom to make the world a better place.
Okay, let me just go back, if I may. There's something you hinted on, or you touched on earlier. You describe, you said, I am a priest, but I'm a scientist. Now, some people look at healing and they say it's either science or it's faith. It's either take the pills or say the prayer, and that if you resort to medicine, then you're somehow weaken your faith, or you are denying the power of God. How do you read such a binary choice?
Yeah, and this is happening all the time, and I suspect it's on the increase as well. The idea that you have to choose. So in the Guild, I mean, our policy 100% is go to the doctor. If you break your leg, don't come to church. You call 999 and go to the hospital. And we, got the modern medicine, psychology is a gift from God, and we must work with God in all these things. But this comes from a very dualistic way of thinking, and human beings like black and white choices. You're in or you're out, and in some ways that's very attractive to some people, but it doesn't deal with the ambiguity of life and what's going on. And health is just one of those things. Health is highly politicized. It's caught up with financial systems of governments, and it's all caught up with choice as well, isn't it? You've got Holland and Barrett on the high street here in the UK, an alternative medicine kind of place. You can buy some pills, or you can go to the doctor. And there's a very strong feeling that to be human is to be healthy and perfect. And that's just not the reality. And the beauty of the Christian healing ministry is that we work to support human flourishing with, in whatever the state of your mind and your body, and hold these things in tension. But to do it honestly, we have to be aware of the tension in this. So I would say the Christian healing ministry is that the miraculous is possible. I mean, when I say I pray for you, I'm doing so in the faith that it's going to make a difference. Prayer works, but it doesn't always appear to work. But the Christian believes the good news of Jesus Christ applies in all situations. So we have to hold that in genuine tension. But what we can offer is a faith, this is a Christian Evidence Society, a faith that, that does death. We've got the best explanation, I believe, for how you can live life in the presence of death. And that's one of the gifts.
Okay, Gillian, there's lots of areas that you're taking us down now, which is absolutely fantastic and fascinating. You pray for people and you have faith because you know that prayer works. But on that pastoral level, when somebody says to you, nothing has changed, I still have this disease, I still have this condition, God has let me down, as his representative, how can you gainsay what your patient is saying?
So 2 responses. First, and this is important, in that room, I continue to believe that God can act and love. And sometimes that's the only thing you can do. And pastorally, the second thing is not to ram down that poor person's throat your perceptions of what they're going through and what God might be up to. There's so much healing that can happen in simply saying, how are you? And this is the key, listening to the answer, actually listening. When a person is heard, neurobiologically, their brain is responding, their immune system is responding. This is something new the science is telling us. But also when somebody's really listened to, we see them, we see their story, and there's something deeply healing in simply listening to somebody's story as well. And keeping faith that whatever pain they're going through, it is known to God, and that ultimately the only healing, the best healing, the most important healing we can have is after death anyway.
Which really brings me on to, I mean, you said earlier there about, Christianity is a narrative, is an experience that faces and deals and has an answer to death. You've just there mentioned death in the context of healing. What would you say is the Christian perspective of healing that might be, say, different from the likes of complementary medicine or food supplements or the body beautiful?
Yeah, well, that's true, isn't it? I mean, when you say health, you think of January 2021, or maybe not this year, but in a normal year, best year yet, get Beachbody ready. Medical science is a very straight view. This is about complete health of mind. So the World Health Organization definition of health is a complete state of mental, physical, and social well-being. I don't think anyone's ever had that, ever. But the Christian view of healing is that when we are healed, we're deeply connected, okay? Connected into ourselves, mind, body, spirit connection, connected into our communities, and connected to God. And when we're able to do that, we can flourish. I love this word, flourish. In fact, I often try not to say the word healing because it just sends red flags up for people. But when we talk about human flourishing, we get more deeply into what we actually mean by Christian spiritual healing. Because when we flourish, we can do the job that God's created us to do. So often when you got a dog collar on, you'll talk about vocation, calling, but all Christians have a calling from God to live a Christian life and to flourish. And when we're talking about the Christian healing ministry, we're talking about getting people to a point where they can express who God wants them to be and their mission to love and to be part of what's going on in the world. I think often we see ill people as, a hindrance or get in the way or a bit useless and can't do much. But the Christian healing ministry recognizes that even when we're ill and we're dying, we can still love. And that's part of the faith.
Thank you. You mentioned you quoted two bits of the Bible earlier, a Psalm and the prophet Jeremiah. In the Bible, Job's friends vociferously argued that he was suffering because he must have had a hidden sin, a deliberate sin, and therefore his suffering, his illness, his plague of boils, and so on, they were a punishment from God. There's still a widely held view, isn't there, where the people call it karma or reaping what you sow, that illness is something that we either bring on ourselves or nudge the Almighty to visit on us as a punishment. To what extent do you think COVID-19 pandemic is a divine punishment?
So it's an interesting question, isn't it, Nigel? We talked about this before. Is that the question? So I'm not sure that's the question people are asking, but it's certainly a question that's knocking around at the moment. Is COVID-19 divine punishment? No, that's an unbiblical viewpoint of what's going on. The overwhelming message of the Gospels. And remember, it's not a manual, it's a book of stories and poems and all sorts of shenanigans. But the overwhelming message is God is love. And God has promised not to punish humanity in whole-scale ways. And I think it's important to remember context of when the Bible was written. So when Job was kicking around, or certainly when they wrote that story, illness being connected to sin was the best explanation they had. So let's think about best explanations. So right now, the best explanation for COVID-19 is not divine punishment. It is, well, that's still an ongoing question, isn't it? Was it that wet market? Was it allowed?
I'm waiting to see which way you're falling.
We don't know, right? But
Okay.
Certainly God's punishing us for sin is not the best explanation. We now have medicine, so we understand viral transmission better than they did when they would have written Job. But a better question, I think, the better question is a more generalized question, which is why bad stuff happens. And I talked about this already earlier tonight. We are at a distance from God. We've got freedom. That means stuff happens. It's how we cope with what happens. That's the question. How do we cope in the situation?
And there you touch on this concept that actually the world is broken. Creation, again, the Bible, I think it's Paul to Romans says, was the effect that the whole creation is groaning. The title of our subject today talks about this being a broken world. How do we find wholeness in a broken world? In what ways do you think the world is broken?
Gosh, it feels like it's so broken right now, doesn't it? We've got COVID, we've got shutdown, we've got all those injustices that were there anyway, boiling to the surface with Black Lives Matter, climate change. So it feels brokener than ever, right?
Yeah.
But I'm Nigel, I'm sure you know the Bible better than me, but that text, creation is groaning as it waits for the revelation of the children of God or something like that, isn't it? So yes, it is groaning, but it always has been. It's particularly bad right now, certainly within this generation, but it's always been like this. And once again, we're back to sin. We're at a distance from God. Do we sit around and just pray for things to get better, or do we get off our butts and try to work to be the children of God, helping to spread love and hope at this difficult time? We can't get out there other people and meet other people. But creation is groaning. We're at distance from God, but it's how we close that gap right now through our actions that makes a difference.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that even something as simple as asking somebody how they are and listening, it is an act of healing. It's something that we all do, and we all can do. I read recently an article in The Economist that says that touch is the only sense that is crucial to human survival. Again, during lockdown, so many people haven't been able to share the healing touch of touch. How important is the need for physical contact between people? How healing is touch?
Oh, yeah. I just think all the time of the people who are single or elderly people or people on wards in the hospital that can't die. I was out for a walk the other day and I saw this tiny child who was walking, but only just. So they must have really come to a sense of self during lockdown. And as I walked towards them, this little child just got out of my way and socially distanced perfectly. And I thought, oh, that's sweet. But then I thought, oh my gosh, that is just horrifying that this child thinks that's how we interact. And touch is so important. Hugging releases chemicals that make us feel good, endorphins. There's lots of science. It lowers blood pressure. It helps us, interestingly, stop worrying about mortality. Something about that physical contact with another person, an actual touch, loosens those worries. It ties us to the living. It lowers stress. It's just so important to who we are. And children, especially if they're not hugged and nurtured when they're young, affects their brain development. This the Adverse Childhood Experience Project and other studies have shown that not being hugged leads to trauma, which is then in later life linked to addiction and lower chances in life. So it is so important, and it is important in the faith. I mean, we're in Holy Week. We're in Lent, coming up to Holy Week right now, when Jesus got on his knees and touched the feet of his disciples and watched them, asking his disciples to do the same. So how do we do it? And how do we do it? And this isn't in the Bible, in a COVID secure way. Interestingly, Public Health England have just published a survey of a study of viral transmission last summer. And one of the worst places was the supermarket because everyone forgot about it. But one of the in a secular report on how to open up society, churches, places of worship, and including churches, were held up as great examples of how to open up in a COVID-safe environment. Transmission was really low in churches. We got volunteers, there was good expectation before people arrived, good signposting, so it's possible. So the question is, why were churches able to do this so well? They're places, they should be places ideally where we care about one another. And we've got a great opportunity to be part of, virus confident society, I read. That's what we're going to be next. Churches can help.
Yes, your mention of vaccine brings another area, which I'll come to in a minute. That endearing story of the child who has grown up and being conditioned to stepping aside and keeping a social distance, as you say, it's a bittersweet thing, isn't it? It's very sweet that the child does it, but it's awful that they should have to. Is there any sense in which we need, all of us, post-pandemic, we need to actually recalibrate our brains, get used to touching each other again, and also stop treating each other like biological weapons?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I was particularly struck in the church, it's a very in churchy kind of chat, about receiving the Holy Sacrament, the body and blood of our Lord, which became an agent of contagion. And we can't do it. So all sorts of church people got in a right throff and laver about that. But it is, I wonder how long it's going to take when hugging is seen as a dangerous thing. We can't get close to one another. I hope it doesn't take too long. But I think we need to make the transition in our head. And it's a traumatizing transition, that things are not going to be normal for many years to come. And that's a hard thing to do. But there has to become a point where we decide to stop waiting for things to get back to normal, and instead living and proclaiming the love of God and building up our communities and our little ones and our old ones in a way that keeps everyone safe. We have a duty to do that, I think.
Thank you. We're talking wholeness, we're talking health, we're talking healing. From a biblical perspective, what does wholeness look like? Because wholeness, it appears to me, seems to be more than just physical well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from the Christian point of view, we would take our lead from the doctrine of creation. Sounds fancy, but this idea that we're made in the image of God, and God is Trinitarian. And I don't, at this point in the evening, want to get too far into Trinitarian theology, but it's both complex, but also so beautiful. God is in community with God's self, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that is a model for how we, as being made in the image of God, need to be in the world, but also to understand ourselves, that we are not just bodies, we're not just minds, we're not just emotions, we're not just a spiritual existence. I said four, but it's kind of three traditional. We're all in communication with one another. So wholeness is paying attention actually to those three. And it does mean looking after the body if we can. It's not a popular thing to say, especially in rooms full of clergy. They're statistically more likely to be overweight. But looking after our bodies is important. It's not the be all and end all, but it's important. We need our bodies to do a whole lot of things in the world. Looking after our mental health. If you're struggling, blimmin' well, get help. You have a duty to do that. And looking after our spiritual life, which is making time to pray and connect to God. So we mustn't take for granted the things we've been given and look after them in order to. Now, this is where we're different from the January 2022 magazine rack or the World Health Organization. We do this. We look after ourselves because we believe we're made in the image of God. But we also have a job to do as well, and to use our bodies to connect with our minds, our spirits, to connect with the community and to spread the message of God's love. for the ushering in of the kingdom. We've got things to get on with.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier death. In one of your books, you wrote that the fear of cancer. Sorry, you wrote that cancer causes the ultimate fear. That is the mortal threat under which we all live. Given that we're all mortal, that the body, as you said, you gave a scientific explanation for cancer a while ago. The body scientifically is carbon-based. Carbon decays. The bodies will wear out and will die. Given that we are all mortal, what is the point of seeking healing and wholeness?
I'm always fascinated how human beings go from one extreme to another, aren't they? It's just like there is a branch of the Christian faith that just say, well, what's the point? We're all, we are destined for heaven. So this is just a mere blip we have to get through. It's a bit inconvenient until we get to heaven. But gosh, there's a lot of the Bible and the teaching of the faith and the history of our church and of holy people that say there's an awful lot to get on with before we get to that point. And one of the responsibilities, I think, is as a Christian, is to use our bodies and our life to make a positive difference in the world. But what the challenge is, I think, is to live a Christian life in everything that we do. It's not just about Sunday best. I go to church on Sunday and we're all sorted. One of the radical things about the faith is that it infuses all aspects of our lives, how we interact with society and how we care for our family. And this is a Christian Evidence Society talk, right? And I think in Edward's beautiful introduction, it was about presenting a reasonable view of the faith. And for me, anyway, I don't think the best way to present the faith is through a series of arguments or doctrines or, clubs that you have to sign up to. I think the best evidence of the faith is a life lived through all the suffering and rubbish we might go through, a life lived in love, despite what we have to face on a day-to-day level. Because there's nothing, I believe, that can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. No death, no suffering, no famine, no COVID-19. But the task is to live well and to live in everything we do with the love of God. And ultimately, that is about being released from the fear of death. It's quite interesting. The word remission also can be translated release. And the Christian faith, at the most basic and most important level, is a vehicle to be freed from that ultimate fear.
Jesus' healing ministry was characterized by a number of strands. He healed the sick. He cleansed the lepers. He cast out demons. These miracles or signs were signs of the kingdom of heaven. Should the church be more upfront about offering healing to people who need wholeness?
It's a great question, and churches have shied away from the healing ministry. Well, it's gone up and down through history. Sometimes it's been at the front, sometimes it's a bit embarrassing. We'll just hide it behind the pews for a bit. Churches have got to be upfront that they believe in God, and that being a Christian makes a positive difference in our lives. The healing ministry, it's important that we do good teaching around what we mean by healing, which I've mentioned is about human flourishing, not necessarily getting better as we define it. So the healing ministry should ideally be performed in or held within a good understanding of what it's trying to achieve. Because I could almost start a whole new charity, bad healing ministries. It has done damage in the past. And so it's important that churches get good training and have good leadership. And that's something we do in my charity as well. That's what we do, the training in that area to help people with this, because it's such a gift what we have right, especially with the COVID and the pandemic. Most people come to church not to arrange flowers or polish pews or join a committee. Most people come to church because they need healing. Something's gone wrong. And they come to light a candle, say a prayer, taken by a friend, with the expectation it's going to make it better. And churches, there's just so much potential, from the welcome at the door to the feeling of healing when you sing songs, to the Eucharist, if that's their tradition, or good preaching, and the coffee afterwards. Maybe that's the only conversation they're having that week. There's so much. That's just on a Sunday. You got a mums and tots group on a Tuesday afternoon. You're dealing with maternal mental health. You got a lunch club for the elderly. You're dealing with loneliness, which is directly related to heart disease and other problems. So this healing potential of the church is huge. But it needs good theological teaching so people don't get hurt.
Yeah, indeed. And that leads us very nicely, actually, to our first question from one of our viewers this evening. The question is, Gillian, how do you help those who believe in healing but find it is actually the church that has caused the pain?
Yes, and there's a lot of people in that category, especially with the uncovering of the abuse that many children and young people have suffered in church. And in my day job, pre-pandemic, I spent a lot of time going out meeting church leaders who are not in a good state of mental health themselves often. They're struggling as well. And, how can they lead positive church communities when the main church is not supporting them in the role that they have? So the first thing I would suggest is find a different church community, the one that might be more positive. And to make the suggestion also that the church itself needs to go through a period of healing. We're at a time of transition in so many different ways, and injustices are coming to the surface. And the church, certainly the Church of England, was in crisis anyway before we got to the point of the COVID pandemic. So there might be large scale questions that need to be answered about how the church operates, whether the church and the ways the church might repent for the abuses caused. But churches are full of human beings, and any large group of human beings, these problems arise. The expectation should be that it's better in the church, and it hasn't always been.
Yeah. Gillian, we spoke earlier about disease and illness being and pandemics being a punishment. But a viewer asks here, it takes a slightly different tack. Do you think that some illnesses are sent by God, not necessarily as a punishment, but to help us become better people? I think Paul argued something similar about this thorn in the flesh that he had. He prayed, asked God to get rid of it. God never did, and so Paul comes to the conclusion, well, actually, I can somehow use it. I can somehow redeem it. Is that how you see? Is that how you see healing? Or not so much healing, but illness or disease?
I mean, my position really strongly, from a deeply held theological position, but also experience, is that God does not send suffering on the people, anyone. But we live in a world where suffering exists. However, different people, we have to be free. I think there's a problem when you're ill is people always tell you how you're supposed to be, that, oh, you're strong, you're a fighter, you'll pull through, or things like that. And it has to be, the ill have got to have a freedom to choose to tell the story they want to tell. So I hated the war metaphor when I was ill, because, you're strong, you're fight. And I go, oh, that's great. What if I'm not? And then I'll die, and it's my fault. I hadn't fought hard enough. That's not fair. That's rubbish. But some people really like that metaphor. I've met people who talk to their cancer. It's part of their body. Other people might go further down the line of what the person with the question suggested. But at a deeper level, that question is quite significant, because my experience is that we can deepen our understanding and our wisdom when bad stuff happens. Not to say that God sends it to us for any kind of lesson, but there's things to learn along the way. And so that is an opportunity. And that's both, practical knowledge, but also spiritual knowledge as well.
Thank you. It's about God being a redeemer then, isn't it? Even the rubbish God can bring or help us to see something within it. Another question. This viewer says, someone here who's living with MS says that God gives them the strength to cope with their condition, but sometimes they've been really angry with God. Have you ever got angry with God in prayer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, sometimes I just, and it's so cathartic. Yep. I know I have sat, not a cancer thing actually, but sat in church, arms folded. I am not standing up. I know I'm not going to close my eyes. No, it's fine. I am cross. And you know what? God survived Gillian's wrath. And there is a huge, rich tradition that the person who asked the question with MS there is fitting into. I mean, the Psalms are full of people saying, this is not fair. I followed you, but you've done this to me, and and they go on and on and on. And God survives every single one of those Psalms. There has to be something in the expressing of that that's important. We know that from a psychological level. And the paramount example is Jesus on the cross in one of the translations. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's God in Jesus Christ. Saying, why have you forsaken me? For me, that is the most gut-wrenching, important moment on Good Friday, where Jesus despaired, yet it was okay. And what we haven't touched on that I usually talk about when we talk about healing is Holy Saturday, the bit between the cross and Easter Sunday. Now, presumably, God could have gone from Good Friday, in the tomb straight up again, but that didn't happen. We had Holy Saturday, and that must be for a reason as well. That period of waiting for the truth to emerge, waiting for the wisdom to come, waiting for the healing to come. The waiting is important.
Here's another question for you then. Many people claim to have been healed by prayer. What's the difference between being healed through prayer and the body healing itself?
Ooh, that's a great question. Gosh. And and who created the bodies? Where do you draw the line? It's a really fascinating question. I certainly personally have felt I've had a miraculous healing in my life. It was for a fever kind of thing. I had no idea what was going on, but it's definitely happened. Yet we have such we don't understand enough about the brain to answer that question fully, I think. So, and when we talk about, it's called psychosomatic immunology, the kind of links between what we think and what goes on in our bodies. And there's evidence that when you are part of a large group of people in a positive way, then your immune system will be triggered, and that can lead to healing. So going to a church service, having a positive experience, that can have neurobiological effects that can help the body as well. But where one ends and the other one begins, I don't think science knows enough yet.
Okay. Somebody's asking, we've touched on the concept of Jesus casting out demons. The question asks, in the Gospels, Jesus quite often casts demons out of people as a way of making them better. Modern hospitals don't have exorcists on the staff. Doesn't this show that the New Testament is miles away from how we see medicine now?
So the stories of Jesus's miracles, and particularly those kind of disturbing stories in some ways, where the person who is on the edge of community and unable and excluded from the community is healed via a bad spirit going into a herd of swine or whatever, so exorcism. Now, there's been a lot of study and commentary about that, and these are stories that can be interpreted in a multitude of ways. For example, this shows the primacy and the lordship of Jesus. It's from a medical point of view, these were people who were mentally ill and not understood in the same way. So I see the distance between where they were then and where we are now as a gradual evolution in our understanding of the human person. And modern medicine now has a greater and deeper understanding of illness and how to make people better. And people are treated with more respect. The most interesting things about those stories, I think, for me, is that all the miracle stories are Jesus performing miracles, but also there are people who are excluded now being included in the community, and that as a general understanding of what the healing ministry about is far more important. Of course, exorcism and deliverance ministry still happens within the Church of England, but it's a specialist ministry, focusing on a different aspect of healing ministry. So yeah,
indeed so. We've just got time for a few more questions. Somebody asks, Gillian, you said earlier that when somebody comes to the Guild, you recommend that they go to hospital. The questioner asks, doesn't that indicate that on some level you already know that God doesn't do any healing?
Well, there's different levels of healing, I think. No, I don't think it does at all. I mean, what do we think goes on at the hospital? It's not sort of magic spells. It's hundreds of years of science. And remember, of course, that hospitals were originally started by monks in monasteries. They are the original doctors. The origins of our hospital system was in the monastic houses of Europe, treated by people whose vocation it is to heal. And who are we to say why they're doing this? I think God gives people lots of different gifts. And so praise be to God that people don't come to church with broken legs, malfunctioning kidneys, eyeballs gouged out, whatever it might be, and expect us to make a bit of difference. Thank God we can send them to hospital. And what we're here for, and hospital chaplains and people of faith, what we're here for is for the deeper healing that might need to come once the leg's been sorted or the cancer's been ridden. We're here for that.
Thank you. Two last questions then, and we'll need to be quick. First one is, how much do you think healing comes about when we believe it will? Is there, I mean, perhaps it's a question of, is there such a thing as a positive mindset?
Yeah.
Positive thinking.
So really interesting. Yeah. So there's a whole new branch of psychology called positive psychology, and positive thinking can change our brain structure and our health, really. But I don't think that's what the question's about. I think the question is about how effective spiritual healing is. And it is solidly in God's hands. But what seems to work well is that where there's much more evidence of it working well is when the person who is asking for healing and the person who's giving the healing, when their views of what's going on are aligned. So when the person comes in faith to ask to be healed and the person who's healing believes that God can heal, then things tend to go in the right direction more often. When we could leave the house, I used to do many healing services. And it was always such a privilege. I remember one in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and people were just queuing up the aisle. And to have that moment of saying your name and saying what's wrong, and somebody saying God loves you, in effect, is enormously powerful. So that tends to work and help.
Thank you. Our last question for the evening then, and very straightforward question. Has your cancer brought you closer to God?
I believe my cancer has brought me closer to myself, understanding myself better. I think any difficult period helps you grow in self-awareness. It's therefore made me a happier, more content person. And it's also brought me closer to God, I think. How do you define that? I'm not sure how you define that. It's given me the courage, I think. It's given me the courage to follow God in a way that I don't think I had before. I survived this illness. It's taught me stuff, and I'm blimmin' well going to make it count. And I believe God is calling me to do something different in the world, just like he calls all of us. So maybe it's given me a bit more confidence to go and do it. It's helped in that way.
Well, long may you have the confidence to do what you are doing. Thank you, Gillian. My guest today has been the Revd Dr Gillian Straine.